Hello, NENSA land and cross-country ski world. We're here today with two special New England and Stratton Mountain School athletes at different parts of their career. We have Will Koch from Peru, Vermont, who's just in his third year of FIS racing. This January, Will had some breakout results at the Youth Olympic Games in Val d'Isère, Switzerland. First placing third in the cross-country cross qualification, and then, of course, claiming one of the historic medals with a third place overall in the 10K Classic. If we run out of questions later, I'd love to talk about it. I believe there were some sweet clister conditions there. And then we have Mr. Andy Newell, who's now primarily moved on to coaching after an amazing career for the Stratton Mountain School and the U.S. ski team. Hailing from Shaftesbury, Vermont, Andy's a four-time Olympian with 3 World Cup podiums to his credit and 2,451 career World Cup points, the most of any U.S. male athlete to date. Digging a little deeper in there, in 2003, he raced both Junior World Ski Championships and in a World Cup. And at the age of 21, he scored his first World Cup points. I'm Justin Beckwith, hiding behind the NENSA logo there and filming and streaming this. I'm the competitive program director for NENSA. And for the next half an hour or so, we're going to have an informal conversation, mostly between Newell and Koch. Please send in questions, and we'll do our best to field them. This is kind of a neat thing for me because I've had the privilege of meeting Andy when he was visiting Stratton as an 8th grader, and also getting to see Will blossom from Bill Koch now through Eastern Cups, Junior Nationals, and then following his escapades abroad. So I'd just really like to thank both of you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Cool. And maybe just to say where, Andy, where you are right now.
I'm just zooming in from my house in Bozeman, Montana, where I've been living with my wife, Erica, for the last 2 years or so. And now, still running my Nordic Team Solutions business and website, and now coaching full-time with Bridger Ski Foundation.
Nice. Where are you, Will?
I'm in Stratton, Vermont right now, actually at school because our internet at home is not quite good enough to do video things. So here we are.
Right on. Okay. Well, we're going to start with Andy speaking a little bit about the topic of appropriate training volumes for junior athletes.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Justin. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in so far. If you do have questions, I think you might be able to type them in on your phone on the Instagram Live, and we might be able to circle back on some of those questions. But like Justin said, I've been part of the NENSA community ever since I was 5 years old or so, and I can distinctly remember visiting the Stratton Mountain School as an elementary school, 7th grade age kind of kid. And I went and joined Sperry in the groups for training. And I can remember Justin Beckwith was there and Matt Whitcomb was there. And I remember Ethan Foster was there. And I remember chasing after Beckwith and Matt and Ethan. And I can remember doing a bounding session around Sun Bowl trails and trying to keep up with those guys. And it was really cool back then to wear like ultimate water bottle holders. This was before anyone had drink belts or drink vests or anything. And I can remember Justin had a pretty cool ultimate water bottle holder, and Matt Whitcomb for that matter. Probably some really cool baggy shorts that we were all running around in. Which leads me to the topic of junior training volume, which I think is an interesting topic nowadays because I think we've seen some change there in the last decade or so. So if I were to rewind to when I was that age of going into Stratton Mountain School as a younger junior, so that means, 14, 15 years old is what we consider like a younger junior. So you've just gotten out of youth racing and you're kind of that J2 age. Back then, like we were training a decent amount of volume, but I think what's increased the most is that the amount of volume in ski-specific training people are doing from the ages of like 15 to 17. That's where we've seen the most change, I think, in the last decade. Because most people, when they go to Stratton or they go to a ski academy or they go to a high school, they're starting out at around like 400 hours a year. Like, as long as you're active really, and you live an active lifestyle, you can basically train 400 hours a year, and you can even mix in a bunch of multiple sports doing that, whether you're playing soccer or running cross country or mountain bike racing or road riding or whatever. Just a combination of multiple sports and ski training, you can hit 400 hours, pretty easily. So that entry level of 400 hours a year for a 14, 15-year-old was pretty standard then, and is pretty standard now. But what we're seeing now more, I think, than when I was Will's age is just kind of people pushing longer workouts, bigger weeks of training, bumping up into the 20-hour weeks from time to time, even as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. And so it seems back in the day, people were a little bit more hesitant about that, with good reason. I think, especially for athletes that haven't like matured, to a point where they're able to put on muscle and have stopped these huge growth spurts, adding a bunch of training volume on top of all that growth that your body is doing can be challenging and tiring for a kid. But at the same time, if they are mixing in a lot of volume and kind of jumping up from that 400-hour range, which was kind of like the base level when I was a kid, there's been a lot of studies out there showing that the more volume athletes train in that window of 15, 16, 17 years old can really boost their VO2 max potential later on in life. So we used to think that a skier's VO2 max was kind of a set thing. It was kind of genetic. So if it really just depended on your parents, if your parents and grandparents were fit folks, you had a destined VO2 max. But more and more research is showing that if you actually do push a high training volume in your late teen years, you can actually increase your potential for a high VO2 max later on. So we're all learning these things now. And I don't encourage young athletes to go like train through the roof necessarily. I think they need to find a good balance. But I think it is totally possible now to be training above 600 hours as an older junior. So that means ages, we're talking 17 years old. No problem for kids to be training 600 hours at 17 years old now. When I was at the age, we were probably under that amount. So I'm going to kick that over to Will, because he's somebody I think that has kind of been on the high end of junior volume training. And so I'm curious, Will, you obviously, when you were younger, like, can you remember back from when you were at that Stratton age? And like, I can remember training with Will when he came up to like my armpit, and now he's, we're the same size. So I'm curious, like when we were doing that training when you were younger, did it feel like a lot when you were younger before you kind of had that growth spurt and stuff? And then now, how do you feel like you handle some of those bigger training weeks, and what kind of like big summer training volume are you doing right now?
Yeah, totally. So first of all, I definitely remember just a lot more recently than you doing that exact same bounding workout at Sun Bowl. It's still happening 20 years later. And yeah, like you said, that 400-hour baseline sort of thing definitely hasn't changed much. And when I came into Stratton Mountain School as like a 7th and 8th grader, I was, I think, around 450 then. So, nothing crazy, good amount, but, pretty basic. And then as I've progressed through the years, I've added around 10 to 15% onto that 450 each year. And now this past year I came in around 700, which was definitely more than my plan, just because I ended up doing a lot this spring since we had so much time on our hands and got out of race season early. But yeah, I think that the most important thing with your training load is to just be really in touch with your body and to be really conscious of how you're training and recovering. Because the worst thing I think you can do is like severely overtrain and put yourself down in a hole that you can't get out of for a long time. And that's just something to be wary of. But I think as long as you're being really careful about getting full recovery after your big training blocks, after your big weeks, then you should be all set as far as hours and as far as, finding that line between too much and not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a
What do
question
you
for you, Will, on speaking of volumes and neat workouts. We put forth this 25K in May challenge to get people out the door, and Will was one of the first guys to submit his ski. And I don't know if you've seen this, Andy, but he did it times 4, and knocks out a 6-hour ski in 100K. Super motivating for a lot of us to see that, and I just kind of wonder what goes into your head or your thought process of how you're going to go knock out something like that.
Yeah, so I was definitely inspired by the 25K in May challenge, and I've done one 100-kilometer ski before. It was when I was a E16. I did 2 laps around Crater Lake in Oregon, and that was actually a lot harder than this 100-kilometer. I barely made it through that thing. So part of why I wanted to do this 100-kilometer was to see if I could feel a big difference between now and 2 years ago when I did it. And fortunately, I did feel a big difference. So I guess I've gotten a little bit fitter since then. And yeah, I think, like I said, it's important to recover after that. I had a full off day after that, and I think that as somebody my age, like my body and other people my age, your body is really resilient, and you can bounce back from training loads like that relatively quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that concept of resilience is what is, I think, adding to the fact that younger athletes are training more and more at a younger age. Because, it used to, when I was your age, the idea of like a skier hitting their peak was after 10 years of training, right? 10 years of full-time training, you might be at your peak. And so kind of the old cross-country skiing model was like 10 years of training puts you around, like you train full-time from like when you're 20 to 30, and then you reach your peak at 30. And that just keeps on kind of moving farther and farther down. Now that athletes are training, we say full-time as being like that 600-hour range that a lot of these younger skiers are getting above, even at age 15, 16 years old. So in reality, that 10 years puts them at 25, 26 at that full capacity level. And I think it'll be interesting to see how athletes like some of these young stars like Bolchanov and Klebo and Frida Karlsson and those folks, how long they maintain that top fitness. So it's kind of interesting. I think it's cool. I like that you mentioned making the easy days easy and the easy weeks easy, because I think that's something that as athletes get older, that's something they need to get better at. You can remember back to when you were probably a youth skier, like 12, 13, 14 years old. We have like one speed, right? It's just like your training speed, and then your racing speed is like maybe a little bit faster than that, but it's just all one speed. And then I like to think of like as athletes get older, so we're talking 15, 16, I like athletes to have 3 different speeds. They have to have a training speed, a interval speed, and then a race speed. And you try to turn that interval speed into like a zone 3 speed. And then as athletes get like 16, 17, 18 years old, I like those athletes to now get like 4 different speeds. So you have an L1 training speed, you have an L3 dialed in interval pace, you have an L4 dialed in interval pace, and you have a race pace. And then you can tack on your like max speed pace on top of that. So it's just, that's a cool way to think about, like, as a youth skier, you really only have like 2 speeds. And as you get older, you get more and more and more speeds, and incorporating a lot of volume training, it becomes even more important to make that training that easy L1 distance training for the most part. We were lucky enough in Congress this past week at the USSA Congress. We had Jan come in and do a presentation on Gus's Schumacher's training for the year, which was pretty cool. And I was really impressed, one, with the amount of volume that Gus was training as an 18-year-old, but also how easy his easy weeks were, and how Jan, his coach, really kept on him to keep an easy week easy. So he still maintained, it just shows that you can still train 800 hours in a year and still have your easy weeks be easy. And I think, if I can remember correctly, Gus Schumacher last year was still not training any more than 10 hours on his easy weeks. Every single easy week was 10 hours. And also taking one off day every week as well. So that's kind of interesting. It's kind of cool that those coaches came up with that guideline. It's like, okay, in order to make sure if a junior is training more and more volume on some of the harder weeks, we want to set that nice true baseline. And I thought it was cool that Jan, as his coach, was like, okay, Gus, on your easy weeks, you're not training more than 10 hours. And I think that allowed him to absorb that training. And Will, are you still taking one off day a week basically, or you try to or do you just go to the gym and do 100 pull-ups on your off day?
Yeah, I definitely take a minimum of one off day per week, and a lot of weeks I even take 2 off days.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really interesting, the concept of how much you vary your easy weeks from your hard weeks and your easy days from your hard days. And I've been during this isolation time, I've been playing around with that a lot, with periodizing more, and with making bigger contrasts and mixing it up differently. So I'll end up with 1 week that's 7 to 10 hours, and then the next week could end up being 24 or more, and then full recovery after that. So yeah, I think it's a really neat thing to play around with, and for everybody to figure out for themselves how many really easy days do you need to absorb something like 20 hours within 4 or 5 days, and how do you feel after that? Do you get a boost? And I think that this time is a really good opportunity to really get in tune with your body and to feel how you're reacting to different training loads.
Yeah. Do you do a morning heart rate test or anything to monitor recovery? Or you just go by feel?
Yeah, so I actually have a watch that monitors my heart rate all through the night, and it can give me like an average. It gives me my average heart rate through the whole night, which I think is a really good tool, because I've always thought that when you wake up, your resting heart rate could be off by a few beats, but your total sleeping heart rate will be a pretty accurate measure of how well recovered you are.
Yeah, that's sweet. Yeah, a lot of heart rate monitors now. I know Suunto, the US team, we were using that First Beat software, and we use the Suunto watches that plug directly into that First Beat software. So we were also wearing, I think for about 3 years or 4 years, I wore a heart rate monitor at night, every night, to monitor HRV. So you can really see, it's kind of crazy. You see the little dips and
you see
throughout the night. Yeah. So that's a super scientific way of doing it. For people that are interested, is the HRV. And I think Polar has something similar now, that you don't have to subscribe to the First Beat software, and you can still monitor HRV throughout the night. The Whoop watches, I think, do something that's pretty similar. It's pretty solid. I always thought just a morning heart rate test where I used a pulse oximeter on your finger. I would wake up in the morning and stick one of those on, and Sperry would have us, I believe Sperry came up with one of those tests in the old Stratton Mountain logs. It used to be the orthostatic test. And you would put the morning heart rate monitor on your finger, get a resting heart rate, stand up and do 30 squats, body squats, and then lay back down, and you see how quickly your heart rate recovers. And I thought that was for a low tech test, that's about as good as it gets. Anyone can do that. And I thought that was really helpful for monitoring recovery, especially on easy weeks, seeing how quickly you bounce back after, whether it's one off day or a off day and a very easy day. And you can see how quickly you get that super compensation after a big 25-hour week, and then you have that 10-hour week. You can really see how quickly you come back to normal. And then that's usually when you would start doing intervals or something again, because you don't want to do intervals too close to a big volume block or anything, you know. So using that recovery marker is pretty helpful to know when you can start training hard again, especially at altitude. So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also another nice kind of function of it is it can even give you an extra day's notice on when you're getting sick, because when you're sick, you see the biggest changes in your sleeping heart rate. Like, just for reference, mine is normally around 50, 55. And then sometimes when I get sick, it'll be up in the high 60s for my average during the night. And so it can be valuable also for helping you totally see like when you're getting sick and then when you're recovering from that sickness.
And are you training every session with a heart rate monitor these days? And when, and if so, like at what age did you start using a heart rate monitor during intervals and stuff?
I definitely do not use a heart rate monitor every session. I only recently actually started using one at all. Up until like 6 months ago, I pretty much went exclusively on feel, and I think that that's kind of valuable because now I don't need to depend on one. And if I think that the heart rate monitor is wrong, I can I can kind of cross-reference it with how I'm feeling. And I think that heart rate is affected by a lot of things that aren't fully training related. Like if you've had a lot to eat right before something, then you'll be a little higher. So I think that a heart rate monitor is definitely a really great tool to use, but that it's also good to know how you're feeling as well.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Yeah, it's not good to become dependent on them, but I think as athletes get older, there does become a point in a junior athlete's career that I recommend they start to use a heart rate monitor, at least every once in a while, to like see where it's at, and like I said, help dial in those 5 different paces, so you really know the difference between an L1 and an L3 and L4 and a speed and everything, you know. Beckwith, how we doing? We got any questions that we need to field?
Just from me or so far, the crowd out there, feel free to shoot some questions over here for our guys to give you a direct personal answer. This is your chance. Before then, Will wanted to speak a little bit about resourcefulness and adjusting both training and lifestyle during. We made it through the first conversation 2 weeks ago without saying quarantine, but we're going to do it right now. How the training and the lifestyle's been different, and when you're not with your team. You've spoken a little bit to it, but maybe you want to.
Yeah, I've definitely touched on that a little bit already, but just that this is such a great opportunity right now, I think, to play around with training and to really do what you need to do for you, and to you can play around with different training blocks and all that good stuff, which I think is kind of cool. And I think that it's the people who are going to do best next ski season are the people that are able to use this time right now that is not normal. The people who do best next year are going to be the ones who use this time correctly.
Tell me quickly about the unicycle.
Oh yeah. So we're actually, I go for, I learned to unicycle when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I've incorporated that into my training a little bit since then. I think it's a really good tool for balance and core stability and just being kind of a more well-balanced athlete. I've done a couple of those this year. This Saturday, actually also inspired by the 25K in May. Me and a couple friends from the Stratton team, me and Chip and Diane, we're gonna go for a 25-kilometer unicycle. or try anyways. We'll see. That's a solid, 3 to 4 hour endeavor. So, but yeah, I think it's a fun training modality if you can learn how.
We've had some guys every once in a while, they'll come up and down app gap on them, which is just kind of mind blowing.
That's crazy.
Well, we had two questions. The first one was, Andy, how has your training changed during now that you're living at altitude?
Yeah, that's a good question. I obviously grew up at sea level in Vermont, and 2 years ago, I guess, was my first time living full time at altitude. But that wasn't really my first introduction to altitude. So when I was like Will's age, I was on the U.S. team, and at that time, they really encouraged us to move to Park City and live there at the training center. So that's what I did when I was Will's age. So I really went from being like a full sea level kid, having very rarely raced at altitude, maybe once or twice at like Soldier Hollow or in Idaho or something. And I remember having like pretty painful experiences racing that high, to then living in Park City, which is at 7,000 feet minimum in Park City. So that took some adjustment. I think some of the ways athletes should adjust their training at altitude is it becomes even more important for the easy days to be easy. Like we were talking about the resilience of bouncing back after a hard session. So hard sessions can come in the form of like volume, as in like a long session, or they can come in the form of an interval session, spending 30 to 50 minutes at L3 or something. And you'll notice at altitude, it takes a little bit longer to bounce back after especially like a big L3 session or a big L4 session. So it just becomes more important to like adjust your easy days. Traveling up and down to altitude is something athletes will get better at. And it's something athletes, if they want to be world-class skiers, they should be conscious of and be thoughtful about their approach to traveling up and down. And so my early days going up to altitude, it would take me potentially 3 weeks to adjust until I felt like myself. And nowadays I feel like I can go up and down and really adjust pretty quickly, because it is something that your body actually gets better at, and you learn what to do, how many days you should go before doing intervals or something, like as soon as you go up to high altitude. And you learn kind of to listen to your body and how your body's really going to feel during those first few interval sessions. Like it may not feel great, but sometimes it's like, you just have to be like, okay, it just feels different. It doesn't need to feel like you don't need to put a label on it, whether it feels good or bad. It just is what it is. And you kind of learn to race a certain way at high altitude. Maybe the biggest difference is the amount of L4 training you can do. So typically training a bunch of volume at altitude is pretty easy. But once you start doing like more than 2 L4 sessions in a week, that's when it can get tough at altitude. And that's also when we try to maybe travel down to a lower altitude if we're living in a place like Park City. A place like here in Bozeman, we're at what's considered moderate altitude. So there actually is a pretty big distinction between 4,000 and 5,500 feet, which is where we're at in Bozeman. So Bozeman's right at 5,000 feet town, which is actually considered moderate altitude. So most folks could come to Bozeman and sleep here in town and not notice any difference. Like you would probably be completely normal. But then there is a big difference between 7,000 feet and up. That's what we consider high altitude, or 6,500 feet and up. And that's because at that altitude, your O2 saturation while you're sleeping drops into like the low to mid 90s. And that's when your body really starts to work to produce red blood cells at night. So the magic number there is about 93% O2 sat. So here in Bozeman, even a sea level kid could come here and probably be at 97, 98. But if you go to Park City, a place above 7,000 feet, and you get in that 93 range, then your body is really working pretty hard at night while you're sleeping. And you notice that in your heart rates, and you notice that in how quickly you recover. But that's also the sweet spot for altitude training. So if somebody's looking to do like an altitude camp, Bozeman's not necessarily a great place to do that, because you're not going to get that big boost in red blood cells like you would in a Park City or a Colorado, someplace above 7,000 feet. So typically when you see World Cup athletes go to an altitude camp before the Olympics or championships, they're going to be above 6,500 feet to get that red blood cell boost. So kind of a long answer, but that's where we're at.
Yeah, that's definitely all good advice for me to hear at this point too, because in a few months at this point, I'm going to be headed out that way. Boulder, I think, would be considered moderate altitude by that definition. It's a little over 5,000. So
yeah. But then a lot of the training, of course, like in here, town is at 5, but you can easily go into the mountains and run at 9, and that's very similar in Boulder too. So some of your sleeping might be at moderate, but some of your training might still be at high altitude.
yeah,
In which
definitely.
case you do need to adjust like I typically take a few beats off my L4 intervals, like maybe not try to push quite as high of a heart rate. It's funny because at altitude you think, oh, maybe my heart rate should be higher. But in reality, your lactic acid is also higher. So sometimes you need to step back your training zone heart rates just a touch, especially at L4 at that kind of altitude.
We had another question, changing gears a little bit. How a high school student would go about trying to make a junior national team.
You want to take that one, Will?
Yeah, sure. I've obviously got a pretty sweet, ideal setup for it here at Stratton Mountain School, because we get time set aside each day for training, and we get a really good opportunity there. But if you are at a normal high school and you've probably got a team that you're training with, then it's a good idea to make sure that you're, in every workout, you're approaching every moment of that workout with the intention of making the junior national team, and that you're really focused in that time. And then if you want to go above and beyond a little bit, it's a good idea to, in the summer, when maybe you're not necessarily training with the team as much, or maybe you're training with the team but only a couple times a week, during that summertime, to really focus and set aside time for training, and to make sure that if you have that goal in mind, then you're going to have to put in a lot of work to achieve it, and some of it you might have to take the initiative on your own beyond even your team to achieve that goal. It's hard from New England.
Yeah, I mean, New England's got a tough JN squad, but that's what makes New England such a great region to be a part of. It's so competitive. But I would agree with Will in that what we're saying here is like the process-oriented goals are what allow you to reach your potential. So I believe Sperry was always really good at having us sit down with him at the beginning of the year and map out our goals. And if making a junior national team is your goal, I think it helps to put that on the calendar, open up your calendar, put junior nationals down there, and that's one of your outcome goals. And then you kind of work backwards from there. So if I were an athlete trying to make junior nationals, I would then say, okay, if I'm going to make this team, I need to race well during these qualifying races, okay, at this JNQ. In order to race well at this JNQ, I need to maybe improve my classic technique and try to race maybe 3 times in December. In order for me to race 3 times in December and improve my classic technique, I need to, maybe roller ski 5 times a week in the summer. In order to roller ski 5 times a week in the summer, I need to improve my specific strength too. So maybe I do one of those workouts double pull, and I need to get stronger in the gym if I'm going to get better at my double pull. So then I set a goal of doing, 30 pull-ups in the gym. And before long, you've taken that junior nationals goal and broken it down to exactly what you could be doing today or this week. And then so you become very focused and aware of your training. And so your training has purpose, and you're not just kind of punching the watch every day in a lost zone. You actually know what you're trying to accomplish on a daily basis.
Yeah, and when you're coming up with those process goals, and you're coming up with what you need to do each individual day to achieve that goal, it's important to base those process goals on your weaknesses, because whatever your weaknesses are, those are also the areas where you can see the most improvement. And if you find the areas where you can have the most improvement, that's where you're going to increase your results the most and achieve your goal.
Got a question here about optimal rep range for strength training for skiing.
Yeah. That's a good one. I've become a little bit of a strength and conditioning junkie over the last couple of years. So shout out to Nordic Team Solutions. Go check out our strength training plans on there. That's a good question. And so I have a few theories on strength. One, your strength training for a skier is going to change dramatically between a youth racer and an older junior racer, specifically when they kind of have that growth spurt, when they change from being a developing athlete to a mature athlete. So developing athletes are basically going to get strong no matter what. So I put them on pretty general strength plans. I think developing athletes or youth athletes can still actually lift weights, but I wouldn't necessarily have them do a max strength phase. So if I'm going to put a hard line on it, which is hard to do because athletes develop at different rates, but I would say U16s and under can do a lot of general strength, which means reps in the 10 to 15 range, but they should also do a lot of power and jumping type stuff. So body weight stuff, learning how to move their body quickly without any weight at all. So I think an athlete of any age can do what we call contrast training, which is where you might do something weighted but not super heavy, and then do something unweighted. An example would be like doing a step up jump or doing a step up with dumbbells, on a box, and then jumping over hurdles. So you've gone from doing something weighted to unweighted, and that's how you train power. And basically the only way to train velocity, which means moving fast on your skis, is you have to train power first. So you build strength, you build power, and then you turn that into velocity on skis. So it's a very straightforward progression. And so youth athletes, I think, can be lifting weights, but with a focus on medium to high reps. So we're talking, 8 to 15 range most often, but also incorporating body weight stuff and really quick dynamic movements and jumping around. Elite level athletes should maybe periodize their strength training a little bit more thoughtfully. And if that's the case, I cycle through a typical progression of general strength, max strength, power strength, and velocity. Those are the 4 basic strength phases for cross-country skiers. And so general strength would be reps in the 10 to 20 range. That's what we're doing right now. When we go to the gym, most of us are, actually no one's going to the gym now, but when we're in our garage, we're doing like push-ups in the 10 to 20 range usually, chair dips in the 10 to 20 range, even core exercises in the 10 to 20 range. And if you want to put on muscle, you need to do those to failure. So that means doing the first few reps in the 10 to 20 and then doing as many as you can. That's how you're going to put on muscle mass and actually gain strength. Next is the max strength phase. And for a max strength, we drop reps down into the 2 to 4 range typically. And so this is really high weight, low rep. And for those kind of strength phases, I'm focusing on a lot of Olympic style lifts, very general style lifts. I like deadlifts, things like that, squats, any kind of Olympic lift where you're having to use your core as well to lift the weights those are the best ones. And then finally a power phase, or the next one, third phase is a power phase, in which case we're doing a lot of that contrast training where you're doing something weighted and then unweighted. We call those supersets. So that's how you build power. And then lastly is the velocity phase. And that's almost entirely body weight. So doing like super explosive pull-ups, explosive push-ups, a lot of hurdle jumps, a lot of plyometrics, a lot of kind of running mechanic type stuff, a lot of single leg stuff. So at that point in the strength phase, we want to start to transition into more ski specific motions. And that means doing a lot more single leg stuff. So single leg jumps, single leg lifts, that kind of stuff. And other than that, you can't go wrong. I have one theory for elite level skiers. I think the only mistake you can do in your strength training is to perform the same type of strength for more than 5 weeks at a time. That's the worst mistake you can do, because your body will have an adaptation to that kind of strength and it will eventually plateau and not get any better. So the name of the game with strength training and periodization is just make sure you're mixing it up every 5 weeks or so.
Yeah, that's definitely all really good advice. That was a very thorough answer there. Yeah, I think that with strength training, it's definitely good to just look at it as kind of a yearly flow also, that kind of as you approach the ski season, you're making it more and more specific to skiing. And So earlier on in the spring, like Andy was saying, you want to work on general strength and building muscle. And then once you have that muscle, you kind of move through the summer, through the fall, taking that muscle and making it more and more toned towards skiing and making it from just normal strength to power, meaning that you're going to be moving weights faster, and then to transfer that power into pure speed down the ski track.
Will does a lot. Will, what's the craziest thing you do in the gym? I've seen you do some crazy stuff. When we're at the training center and at the US ski team in Park City, I'll be doing like a normal strength routine with some of like the development team kids, and I'll look over and Will's like swinging from one rope to the other like Tarzan or something. So what kind of, you like to have fun in the gym?
Oh, I definitely do. I've been doing I've been coming up with some pretty ridiculous exercises during Corona time. Let's see. So at my house, we've got a slack line set up, and we've got some rings, and I've got a pull-up bar at home. And yeah, on the rings, you can swing up like 15 feet above the ground and do muscle ups on those, and do pull-ups upside down. And on the slack line, you can do all sorts of fun, cool balance stuff. Lately, like I was talking about, using this time to kind of do your own thing and experiment. I've been trying to integrate more calisthenic stuff into my strength routines, which is like kind of down on the floor on your hands, trying to balance in different ways, and it uses a ton of core and uses your whole body. A lot of motions that kind of relate to skiing. I think it helps engage your core all the way from your shoulders down to your knees. And yeah, I've been doing a lot of interesting exercises lately.
That's cool. It's like a mix of old school and new school right there.
Oh yeah.
That's what we do here in New England. It's a mix of old school and new school.
Yep.
That's awesome. Well, we've been going for 45 minutes, believe it or not. I did want to pose one more question here. We're seeing unprecedented success with our U.S. juniors right now, but especially I was reminded of it as I was doing some research. There was really another area of success or era of success in the early 2000s with Andy and the Foster brothers, and I believe it was also part of the beginning of sprint racing as well. But Andy placed, I believe he went to 3 junior world championships, and in all 3 of those you qualified second in the sprint. Andy's also been instrumental in this last time of mentoring many of our current juniors, as I think we're already hearing that scenario between the 2 of you right now. And of course, you've worked even more with some of the older athletes. I was just wondering if you could maybe talk for a minute or two about what that culture was like back then and how it compares to today. And then maybe Will could follow that up by trying to describe what the USA culture feels like right now for him.
Yeah, for sure. So I got involved with the U.S. ski team as a high school student, which was in the early 2000s. And that sounds like a long time ago at this point, but sprint racing was actually around for a long time before that. So they had sprint races even as early as the 90s on the World Cup. And the first World Championship sprint was in 1999, which is actually a fun fact. They had sprinting on the World Cups, and they had a World Championship sprint before they ever had a true mass start World Championships, which is kind of funny. So even in 99, they had sprint racing, but they didn't have any true mass start races. Still, the only mass start race was the relay. That was the only time everyone was starting together. So mass start racing really didn't come in until 2003 at those World Championships, which were my first World Championships. That's when they had a skiathlon for the first time, and that's when they had a mass start 50K for the first time. So it's kind of cool. Sprinting is actually older than people think. And as a junior, going to junior nationals with NENSA and in New England and stuff, we had what was called a prologue, back then, and it was just a one lapper instead of a sprint. You did it as hard as you could. And then must have been around the same year, they had the World Championships for FIS. We had a junior nationals sprint as well. So that would have been around 99. And I remember Lowell Bailey won the first ever sprint. I was in the final against him as a J1, but he snuck in there and took the win. But I think as Americans, we kind of capitalized on what became a much more dynamic style of skiing and a much faster style of skiing. I think if Bill Koch was around like today, he would be an amazing sprinter, because we are people that enjoy moving quickly on our skis. We like to have fun with the terrain that we're skiing on. And I think New England is the perfect place to train that kind of speed, where you learn to carry speed through transitions and around corners. There's so many fun ski areas in New England that are perfect for that kind of training. And so I was one of those kids that just enjoyed going fast and trying to just go as quickly as they could from, around loops and the ski trails, and try to figure out what I could do with my technique to make myself go faster, figure out how I could ski corners and different elements of a track to allow myself to just move quickly. And so that progression into sprint racing came pretty easily, or naturally to me. And then it was around the early 2000s to mid 2000s that the ski team started training pretty full on for sprinting. And I was recruited as more of a sprinter to the US ski team, which is why they notched down my hours actually. Looking back at it, it was probably not a great idea, but I decreased my hours of training in my early 20s, which was probably not great developmentally for my long distance training or distance racing, but we did focus on speed. And so it was folks like me and Keegan were really focusing on that kind of speed. And here in the US, we developed a fun culture around sprinting. We were innovative, I think. For the first time ever in ski racing, we were innovative, coming up with new types of intervals to do, new strength training to do, when all these other ski nations like Norway and Russia were pretty kind of old school and stuck in their ways. And I think the US was pretty quick to adapt to a new race format. And because of that, we became pretty successful at it. And you had folks like Keegan and myself as juniors, placing in the top 10 every year at juniors, and being in the top of the top qualifiers, and racing world championships and stuff like that, at a young age. So I think in some ways, our culture of just having fun and moving quickly on skis has helped us become fast sprinters. And the fact that we're pretty resourceful and had to reach out to track and field resources and cycling resources instead of just being stuck in a cross-country skiing bubble. We actually took a lot of our sprint training from track and field athletes at the USOC and cycling athletes at the USOC and turned that into what is now pretty common ski training internationally and across the board. Willie?
Yeah, I think that it's a super exciting time right now to be a junior skier, because pretty much my whole life I've had Ben Ogden 2 years ahead of me, and just a good bit faster than me, and so I've been able to chase him ever since I was literally 5 years old. And now he's out there, getting gold medals at World Juniors. So it's definitely a super exciting time to be a junior skier in America, and to be part of this next bubble. I think when I think of US skiing for men, I guess there have kind of been three bubbles. There was one pretty sizable bubble back in my dad's day. There was him, and there's the Timmy Caldwell, and there was Dan Simino, and those legends, and they had some really great success on the World Cup back then and Junior Worlds and all that. And then there was your bubble, and now there's this next bubble with Ben and Gus and Luke and Johnny and all those guys right ahead. So it's definitely really exciting coming up as part of this with those guys to chase. And yeah.
That's great. We've got one last question, maybe from the folks on the gram here. It's essentially saying you guys are innovators, and if one of you are the head of FIS, are there any different race formats you would push for?
I don't know, Will.
I think that if I were the head of FIS, I would make a ski cross more regular thing on the World Cup. At the Youth Olympics this year, that was the first race. In case you guys don't know, a ski cross it's a lot like a sprint, but it's basically a sprint with obstacles and with jumps and with slaloms, and but it's still really short, so you're just trying to get through everything as fast as you can. Then you have a qualifier like that, and then you go into the heats, and you have 10 people at once going through this obstacle course. And that was just so much fun, all of that chaos and sprinting. And yeah, if I were head of FIS, I would try to make that more common.
It's cool. I know, it's classic. I'm gonna retire right when FIS starts having ski cross World Cups. I know it's gonna happen. So, but that's kind of like the same. Like, it's like Bill Koch should have been a sprinter too. He could have been an amazing sprinter, and man, just a decade too late. I know I'm gonna be a decade too late for ski cross too. But it'd be fun to do a race with jumps and that kind of stuff, like a sprint race. But I think all types of races are what make our sport so unique. Like, I look at swimming, I look at track and field, and it's such a different sport to know exactly the distance you're racing, know exactly the track in which that race is going to take place, and just dial in your training so much according to that very specific race venue. And skiing is so mysterious in the fact that we have such different race courses from venue to venue, and we have more distances than any sport out there. It's kind of crazy that we compete in sprints, like 15Ks, 10Ks, 30Ks, 50Ks, and it's the same athlete competing in all these races. So it's kind of wild. But I think that's kind of what's at the heart of cross country skiing. It's like there's going to be point A and point B, and your job is just to get from the start to the finish as quickly as possible, whether it's over 50K or whether there's going to be jumps and bumps and, you know, other competitors along the way. I think that's what cross country skiing is all about. And so I'm glad that, and I think it's fun that there's so many different formats out there.
Got to address this one before we let you go, and hi to Erica, and thank you for letting you be here, and mom and dad too, Will, if you're holding anybody up. But I have not heard from Spencer Morris, and I believe Spencer Morris just checked in, and he wanted to know, I think he has an idea of the answer, but who had a better truck, Spencer Morris or Ethan Foster?
I guess we'd have to say Spencer, since he's asking the question. It's good to hear from Spencer. I mean, that's so funny. It's such a cool ski SMS community that you can hear from folks like Spencer. Spencer was like a senior when I was maybe in 8th grade, and we were roommates together at Stratton. So I love it how they just stick all the Nordies together like that. It was fun.
Yeah, I haven't heard from Spencer in forever, so that's pretty neat that this brought him out.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, awesome, guys. Thanks so much, and good luck with your training, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Right on.